going to turn this on and get started, I suppose. I think the batteries are fresh. So tonight, we could, number one, pick up where we left off, which we've been going pretty slowly. But I'd rather hurry up and move up to where we're really supposed to be. And that would be chapter 3, where we're talking about fallacies. That would be the first half of this evening, and then the second half will begin looking at the Aristotelian system. By the second half, the meat of the course is really going to start with that, because once we start doing the Aristotelian system, then we're looking at a formal logic system that has right and wrong answers. So, for example, when we do the second test, which will be based on the Aristotelian logic, there's right and wrong answers, so I can actually have a test. I'll give you 15 syllogisms, and we'll literally analyze those, and there's right or wrong answers. So the test will be based on whether you understand them or not. If you don't, you can always just do some more work on them, right? So if you don't get them, don't worry, we'll keep working at it. But there will be right or wrong answers. The first test, remember that I could just ask, they're all, what's your own point of view on what music are you going to pick? How would you deal with the abortion issue at work or something? That's really your choice. I'm just engaging you in kind of a Socratic dialogue over those issues.
We're not supposed to relate the answers to the reading, like trying to argue or explain?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Of course, if you think, for example, the difference between a objective reporting article in the paper and an opinion piece, right? They're even in separate parts of the newspaper when you think about it, right? And the opinion pieces are the author's arguing a particular point of view that he wants to persuade you to think is correct. And you could be persuaded or not. It's totally what's your point of view as you're looking at it, and that's how that works. The objective reporting, on the other hand, is the description of something that happened, and there shouldn't be opinion in it. I mean, to some extent, of course, there is, because the vocabulary you use to describe something indicates whether you think somebody is positive or negative, in a positive or negative light, and so on. And that's perfectly normal. In a sense, I think it's right to say that there is no completely objective way of viewing the world, right? That's, when you think of the model-dependent realism point of view, when you create them, you need the model first in order to feel like there's a reality out there that matches the model. Without a model, we don't have a sense of the reality that you're talking about. It's just a contemporary way of understanding the way the human minds work, right? Of course, it used to be that people thought the way, they talked about the world was the way the world was. But now we're much more sophisticated. We realize the world's much more complex, especially when we know there's so many different people from different cultures speaking different languages. They see things differently. It doesn't mean that they're wrong and we should kill them. That's not what that means, right? Instead, it gives us a sense of the richness of all of the different ways of viewing our experience as human beings. But it also is pretty easy to see, without a language you can't talk about anything. Right? That's just the way it is. And your language is going to structure how you see things. So when we talk about objective reporting, we have to recognize that, of course, any article that's supposed to be an objective reporting piece about something is going to be in a language or a couple, right? It's kind of neat, the graduation at Harvard this year, the speaker was Chancellor Merkel from Germany. And she did speak in English some of the time, but for the most part of the speech, she spoke in German. So, you know, and there was a translator, because of course the assumption was most of the Harvard people sitting there in the audience didn't speak German. So there was a translator. But so if you're going to be objective about, you know, what happened there, you're going to end up, of course, having to speak more than one language. Because you're describing German, the German speech, or you know, whatever you have to. But basically, you could still argue that German and English are so close that they're culturally very similar compared to, say, Chinese and English. That would be interesting to try to understand the objective way a Chinese person views something compared to an English-speaking person. And they have done tests of that sort, and they've concluded certain interesting things about the difference. That Western languages tend to be much more object-specific. So we see objects in an environment, whereas Chinese and other Asian languages, I presume, tend to see the environment, and then within the environment they see objects. So somehow you can test that. I don't understand the difference actually, because of course I don't speak one of those Asian languages to know what they're talking about. And I've talked with some folks, it's kind of interesting, just this last week I was talking with a visitor from China who was studying economics here, and I tried to get a grasp of how she might see that whole issue, but I don't think she really understood where her English wasn't good enough, and of course I don't have any Chinese, so we didn't really get to the meat of the issue in talking about that. But so basically, the idea of anyone being completely objective, the no spin point of view, you know, is in a sense its own spin. It's its own bias. I think that's pretty obvious that you can't really be completely unbiased. What do we usually mean by that? That you're listening to both sides. You know, the two kids are mad at one another. You being the good mom, you know, you want to find out, you know, what happened, so you try to get both kids to explain what happened. You're, in a sense, you're certainly being objective that way. But you want to smack both of them at the same time. That kind of objectivity, right? But the of course goal of objective news reporting is that's how you get facts. In the sense of so an opinion piece might mention facts, right? But at the same time, the goal of an opinion piece is to persuade you, and there are probably going to be value statements in an opinion piece. You should not do such and such, right? And you should not hear those in an objective piece, because of course an objective piece doesn't have shoulds or would, you know, whatever, you know, no values should be entered into that, because that's an odd situation that we find ourselves in. Really only began to be like that in roughly around 1750, 1760 AD. And that was because of the Scottish philosophers at the time, who were basically pointing out that value, when you try to argue a point of view that contains a value, it ends up with a fallacious argument. Why? Well, if we think how arguments work. So if I have a premise, do you want two S's or an E? You prefer an E? Like that? Either way, I've seen it spelled so many. But so I can have premise 1, premise 2, and then the conclusion. So however you want to number that. And if you look at this, what we basically would want to argue in a formal sense is that the conclusion can only contain what's already in the premise. Right? So if you have vitamin C improves your
Skin?
okay, does it? I don't know. I guess so, because you get scabies. If you don't have vitamin C, that's
Scurvy?
scurvy. Yeah, when they went to sea, they would get sick because they didn't have enough vitamin C. Captain Cook apparently was the one that realized if we bring fruit and make everybody eat fruit. And in fact, I think they used limes because they kept real well. And as a result, the British sailors started being referred to as limeys. I don't know if you've heard that, right? But the idea is the vitamin C prevents it. So vitamin C is good for your skin. I want to say it that way. Okay, that should work. Yeah, that works good. So vitamin C is good for your skin. Taking vitamin C will help you stay healthy. So if you want to stay healthy and keep good skin, you should take vitamin C. Okay, so I have an argument, right? What happened though is that I added in the conclusion, you should. And that's not in either of the premises. So strictly speaking, that's a fallacious argument. There's something in the conclusion that's not in either of the premises, right? You could fix it. You could fix it by saying, okay, taking vitamin C is good for your skin. You should want to care for your health, so you should take vitamin C, right? So that now I have an argument that's a valid, I think, argument. But basically, now the problem I have, I've just pushed it lower, is that now when I go to my premise, it's no longer objective, because I've got a should in there, which is a value statement. And my value statements are not necessarily going to, some people say if you want to take care of your health, you should want to take care of your health. Well, what if I don't care? My life, is horrible. I want to die as soon as possible. It annoys the heck out of me every time I get near a bridge. Somebody puts a fence in the way and I can't jump. And then somebody comes along and says, you should want to take care of your health. I say, oh, go to Timbuktu, or wherever you want them to go, right? It sounds pretty odd to me to feel that way. It would seem to me everybody would certainly feel positive about wanting to live forever, or something of that sort. Take care of yourself. You should do what's good for you. That seems pretty persuasive, right? But it isn't. It isn't objective in that sense, because it's based on a moral point of view. And here's the odd thing. Morality is neither true nor false. It's not scientifically object. I mean, I can have a description of someone being moral and say that person believes in these moral principles and they actually live by them. They're not a senator or something, right? I'm just kidding. There's probably at least a couple senators that are moral, but I'm just, you're counting the ones you know. I know some people that are politicians that are extremely moral. They're wonderful people. Sorry, where was I going with that? It got me distracted.
Morality is neither true nor false.
Yeah. How do you like that? Now you can see that that's something that happened in the 1770s, thereabouts. Thanks to, in fact, I can tell you who it is. And Daniel Dennett, by the way, would be one of those, although he doesn't. But David Hume.
You said that was a Scottish philosophy origin?
Yes. In fact, I think many consider David Hume to be the most famous Scottish philosopher. And it also applies to things like saying, dandelions grow in Alaska now. They're all over. So therefore, dandelions should grow in Alaska. Now, of course, you actually have people that will argue that dandelions are an invasive plant. They've been invasive since I've been here. I've seen lots of them. There are certainly more of them, I think, than ever. I remember when we first came up here in 1987, the wildflowers were incredible. They were all over. Everywhere you went, you saw wildflowers just of all sorts blooming up here. And dandelions have been really pushing a lot of those native flowers out of fields and things, because they just are so dominant as they come up. And of course, there's other things coming up this way too. But so, what's wrong here? If I'm saying, what's my problem is I'm saying this is the way things are. Dandelions are growing here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they should grow here, right? And so this is referred to as the is, because this is the case, and it ought to be the case, right? Is ought. So it's the is ought. I don't know, I didn't read through this to see if it's mentioned somewhere here.
Isn't that also just a part of rhetoric, like, as in you should clean your car versus, like, you should be able to get into Princeton kind of thing? Like, I mean, there's two different definitions there. I mean, a dandelion doesn't have.
Yeah, there is a difference
a frame of
because
mind.
in the one case you're predicting what might happen. You should, you know, if you apply to Princeton, you should be able to get into Princeton. Right?
Right.
Whereas your car looks like my car, so you should wash it.
Then also a dandelion doesn't have a brain, so you can't tell it you should do something and have
As
it
far as we know.
interpret it.
As far as we know, don't get caught being a speciesist now. You're suggesting that dandelions don't have feelings. My goodness, they might.
What does loop around into fallacies though? They're right. Just because it hasn't been proven doesn't mean. Just because it hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's not true. But also, what was that? I can't remember that exact part of it. But
Well, yeah. Well,
just because it hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's not true. Kind of thing. They were going. I'm pretty sure it was fallacies.
you
That
know,
they
I
were.
remember that from Dr. Seuss. You know, if such a thing could be, it certainly would be.
Or if it hasn't been proven, then it still could be. Yeah, it was
Right,
interesting.
right. And the trouble with, well, and actually, David Hume did this to science as well. prior to David Hume and his time period, people thought that, gosh, if you see 4 examples of something, then they're all that way. But what David Hume did was demonstrate that just because we've experienced something a certain way doesn't mean that it will continue to be that way. And why is that the case? Well, it turns out that we're dependent on our memory of previous events. And we're thinking that the way we remember things being, that's what we can expect to happen again. And frankly, that does work for us really pretty well. But occasionally, you remember something, and it turns out not to continue to be that way. There's something about it that you didn't understand, and it's no longer there. I mean, every time I go out and I start the car, it starts right up. One morning I go out and I turn it on, and it doesn't. Well, okay, so there's other factors now that have affected it. I'm still surprised because I didn't expect it not to start, but now it doesn't. David Hume's argument in that particular set of things really covers a bunch of things. Causality is one of them. So he has an argument where he's playing billiards, right? And he's lined up on the cue ball. And he takes a shot, and it goes a certain way. Then he puts it back and sets it up so that he can do it again exactly the same way. And of course, each time he takes that shot and everything's all set up, you would expect it to go exactly the same way. But then he says, but I can imagine, actually I'm going to fudge this a little bit, but that's where you line up and you take the shot, and as the cue ball's heading towards the 8-ball jumps up in the air and goes, ha ha, you can't get me. And the cue ball goes, hey, you can't do that, and falls into the pocket. Scratch. What just happened, right? Well, my favorite, answer to that is you went into a tune. Remember Who Framed Roger Rabbit? You ever saw that movie, right? All of a sudden you're, worried about dip and, et cetera. So of course none of that is part of David Hume's approach to it, but the thing is you can imagine something else happening than what previously happened in all your experiences. And David Hume argues that means that what happens cannot be logically necessary. Can't be logically necessary. Because if it's logically necessary, I can't hold a contradiction in my mind. I can't imagine both the cue ball doing one thing and doing the other. But since I can imagine both of those, that means it's not a contradiction, a logical contradiction. So it's not logically necessary. But we still want to think that causality is necessary. But if it can't be logically necessary, what kind of necessity is it? And he says it's, as a matter of fact, necessity. But where do we get that? We get that from our memory of past events. And the trouble is, our memory can mislead us. I can't trust my memory. And so, in a strict sense of proof, because our memory is fallacious, remembering past events is not proof for how the future is going to be. We almost always, it depends, of course, on the situation. It might really work fine. There's lots of, these are inductive problems, right? Where I'm experiencing something, and based on that experience, I'm presuming, so I have a premise, this has happened before, that happened again, it will happen in the future, is my conclusion. But guess what? well, sometimes my past experiences, do not follow my previous experience, right? I end up with some, surprise. Wow, I always had, a particular plant growing in this spot. What happened to it? It's not there this year, What happened to that? People were always nice, now all of a sudden, they hate you. What did I do? There's always these surprises that await for us. And that affects causality. And ever since that argument that Hume gave, we've ended up then with scientists who've been influenced and understood that. And all scientists have been influenced by that by now. And there was a period of time where it didn't take, but now it's certainly the case that scientists don't say that they've proven something. Instead, they argue that this is the current hypothesis. For the, at the moment, we've got a hypothesis that, and obviously in some cases they're incredible. We can put people on the moon, we have, right? We can put people on Mars. Well, no, we haven't done that, except in the movies, right? And put people on Mars yet, theoretically, right? But so we've got hypotheses that are strictly speaking a guess, but they're so accurate it's ridiculous almost to think of it as a guess. It feels like a sure thing, but strictly speaking, they never officially say it's a sure thing. It's not approved. And the reason for that is all of our inductive reasoning is based on previous experience, even if it's your records that you're looking at, right? They still could be wrong. The future is not guaranteed to be exactly the way the past has been. And so we don't talk about cause and effect as being logically necessary. We would like to think of it as necessity. We talk about necessary causes and sufficient causes and things of that sort. But we are always going to refer to it as a hypothesis, a theory. Theories are neither true nor false either. Statements can be true or false. Theories are interpretations of the data. And as interpretations, they're stories, basically. And if you think of them that way, you realize that you can have one theory, you could have another theory. Which theory is the one that's true? Well, you've got aesthetics involved. So, Einstein famously thought it had to be the simple theory. There's even an expression associated with William of Ockham, the principle.
Occam's razor?
Occam's razor, or the principle of parsimony.
We sure do make a lot of laws if they're all theoretical. It's funny that in the sense that there are so many laws of physics, laws in anatomy and biology, and then there are so many things that, as you said, are just simple theories, like even the theory of evolution. Even though basically everybody in the scientific community says, yeah, that's how it is. It is quite funny. It's I guess that'd be another thing about rhetoric.
Well, with evolution, there's a really, I think one of the best books I've seen on it is by Stephen Jay Gould, and it's The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. It's a little book. It's about 1,200 pages.
Oh, that should be a nice read in an evening.
Did you say 12?
1433.
1,400 pages?
1430. Well, that's part of the index, the notes, bibliography, etc. But what I learned from that is that evolution has evolved.
The concept of it?
The concepts of evolution. Yeah, he goes into the history of evolutionary theory,
Oh yeah.
how it's changed in its structure, and you know, there's competitive theories. So and there's no doubt that change takes place.
Mhm.
The question is what theories are we going to use to explain how it takes place? But let me get back to this other. So David Hume kind of put the quash on that sense of certainty. But other things was also the fact-value distinction. So up until that point, people certainly, especially if you were part of the Christian worldview, and still in, of course, other ethical worldviews, believe that certain moral principles are true. That's, you know, in a sense, you know, if you argue the point, you're considered a heretic, and that might not be good for you, depending on your circumstances. That's clearly still the case in places today. Is the camera still on? I want to make sure, because I wasn't
Yes,
sure.
it is.
Good. Okay. But in the West, where David Hume's had an impact, especially, the recognition that a scientist is expected to discover facts, and based on the facts, construct theories, right? Which then could be very useful, and have been, obviously. There's a fact-value distinction. It's kind of odd, because what we want to do is say we want good scientists. Strictly speaking, the trouble is you can't be a good scientist unless you believe in morality, because to be a good scientist requires you to meet certain principles, which are moral principles. For example, to be a good scientist, you want to be accurate. You don't want to lie about what you're discovering, right? So if you do a study on a particular new medicine, and you find that it actually is harmful to some of your patients, but if you report it that way, you're going to end up not getting as much money, then you're certainly not going to, you know, there are going to be some scientists that won't report the bad effects. Another interesting situation just occurred, and that was Pfizer had analysts reporting that in a large 100,000 patient study, they discovered one of their medicines that they were giving to people for arthritis turned out to have good results, possibly, for preventing Alzheimer's. And so they wanted to do a specific study to find out if that in fact was the case, because then they could, of course, start advertising that this medicine is also good for preventing Alzheimer's, which a lot of people would really appreciate right now, right? But the thing was, the medication had met its 13, it had been around for 13 years, it only had 2 more years left where Pfizer would be able to profit from it before it would be open for other people to copy it. And they decided, well, it's not worth the money in order to do those tests, because by the time we do the tests and then advertise it for that, we won't be making the profit off of it. So they just dropped it. Like, we're not interested. And of course, you know, why is that the case? Well, it's the profit is more important to the company than the moral idea of serving, you know, the world of patients that are out there dependent on your medicines. Right? That was in the news. That was an objective report about that situation. Right? That just happened, what, last week?
would be the log in
Z.
that. Oh, wow.
So I mean, see, that's, so when you're looking at something like this, you feel like, gosh, that's morally wrong for a company not to process that and try to figure out what's going on. So, right. So what I'm suggesting is when we talk about scientists being good scientists, there are specific things that we mean. They should be moral. They should be accurate. Right? They're not just trying to get ahead. They're not competing against other scientists just for their own benefit. They're thinking about the best interest of the community, etc. Those are all moral characteristics, not science characteristics. So if you think of it, in order to be a good scientist, you have to live in a moral community that has moral beliefs, which are not scientific, in that contemporary kind of sense of science. When we talk about science in general, the word scientia is Latin for knowledge, and the medievals considered some sciences, for example, theology, which is the queen of the sciences, because you're looking at the highest concern morally is whether God exists or not, right? And that's the highest science, literally, in that way of thinking. Yes? No?
I don't know, that's interesting, I've never heard
Never
anyone
heard that?
say that.
When you think of the quadrivium and the trivium. So this is that may not be the best. Go back and just pick quadrivium. So when you're looking at, so quadrivium is 4. Quad. We get the same, right? And trivium is 3, right? So there's 4 subjects and 3 subjects. And when you would study, you're literally working your way up from the bottom, and the bottom is arithmetic. Here we go. The bottom is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So if you think about it, right? Grammar, how you speak, right? The first thing that you have to learn in studying, as far as they were concerned, is how to speak properly. And that means studying your grammar. Once you learn that, right, then you can study logic so that you can think properly, right, and form arguments, structure arguments with sentences, right? So, and then you're going up higher, right? And you end up with rhetoric, which is making a whole speech, becoming an orator, right? And then you go up still further when you move to the quadrivium, and now you get arithmetic, which is more abstract. And then from there you get geometry, which literally is arithmetic applied to space, right? And then when you go still further, you end up with, and I know you might think this is odd, but music. Because now you're talking about something that's invisible. It's obviously a beautiful art, but at the same time, it's invisible. So very, very abstract. And by the way, that remember, they think that the angels are singing. You've heard that? Yes? The choirs of angels, right? Well, those choirs of angels, the angels are planet pushers. So all of the planets that are going in their various orbits are being moved by angels, and you know, if you hear an arrow go through the air, you hear it, right? And so they were convinced that things that move make a noise, and so the planets must make noise, and because they're up close to heaven, they must make perfect noise. So the angels are choirs, and the choirs are because of the various levels of planets. Remember, they didn't know all the planets. Well, we don't know which planets are which right now, thanks to astronomers that argue over whether or not Pluto is a planet. Is it a planet again? I thought they were arguing that Pluto's back to being a planet.
I think they said that it is a planet again, yeah.
I think it is. Yeah. Well,
It's- It's questioning.
You can
Well,
Google it.
there are some other. Yeah, I know Google is fantastic. I'm addicted, but you know there are other spheres. I don't know what to call them, that are bigger than Pluto, but haven't previously been referred to as planets. The problem was that they were finding so many of them that we were going to not be able to remember all the names of planets. So at some point they said, that's it, no more planets, you know, and in fact Pluto's smaller, so it's not a planet. And
They've been doing that for a while, right? Naming
It's-
planets
they've been fighting over
UV36 and
that
Things
one
like that.
astronomer from New York, I can't think of his name, he's great though. But he's apologized for causing the problem. Okay. And then the very last one, of course, astronomy. Studying the stars, the movement of the planets and the stars. So if you're looking at the way this worked, you're you know, the way that they approach studies were higher. Literally one field was higher than the other, right? Because you're going up in abstraction and up to the stars, right? Forget how I got into that. How? So the principle of parsimony is the idea that a correct theory should be simpler than a more complex one. They have to be beautiful and they have to be simple, right? And when you look at the actual the way it's expressed by either Occam or others, it's the principle that the most acceptable explanation of an occurrence, phenomena, or event is the simplest, involving the fewest entities, assumptions, or changes.
so essentially it's Occam's razor, right?
Yes. Yes.
Under a different name.
Yes. Occam's razor. If you're not familiar with William of Ockham, at least 3 different spellings of Occam. But my favorite presentation, if you will, of William of Ockham is in the movie The Name of the Rose. You ever heard of it? Name of the Rose?
Makes me think of Shakespeare. A rose by any other name wouldn't sound, or would smell as sweet. Any relation?
No.
Within these walls, men come to seek God. He has come to seek a
Sean
cure.
Connery? He's William of Ockham.
Educated under a window which was found closed several times. A man of reason in a world of blind faith.
Yes, small blood here. You mean that he committed suicide?
elementary, and a crime that will not be
Also,
suppressed.
like Sherlock Holmes.
Ink stains. He did not write with his tongue,
Don't like this place.
I find it most stimulating. Tell him. No, I am most curious to see the library for myself. May I do so? No. But what if you should learn it of his own accord? Written with lemon juice. Hey, who's there?
You overestimate his talents.
This one, I grant you, did not commit suicide. When he is challenged by a man of cruelty and power, the hunter becomes
Who actually became the Pope eventually. In the movie he dies, but in real life he didn't. So,
Had someone else not
Listen.
chosen to look in the wrong direction, several men of God might still be with us.
Other monks will meet their deaths here, and they also will have blackened fingers and blackened tongues. This man is back, just as Brother William foretold.
Yes, I was right.
We knew. Just as I, too, would have known that I'd been the murderer.
You will not reign.
Lock them up!
One final murder has been planned.
Master? Master? How do we get out?
With some difficulty. And it's his. Sean Connery. F. Murray Abraham. The Name of the Rose. A story of unholy murder.
Sorry, I just really like that movie, and it's cool. Officially in the movie, he's not William of Ockham because they call him William of something like Sherlock Holmes. I forget. But the thing is, Umberto Eco, who was the author that wrote the book, kind of mixed Sherlock Holmes and William of Ockham together in a real historical monastery, and where they actually had a conference over it. So it's just fun. But so William of Ockham, but very detailed work at the time, very interesting. If you're interested in that sort of thing, take my early philosophy course, ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy. It's a lot of fun. But if you think about it, what would make that right? That the simplest explanation is the correct one. That's a preference we might have, but complexity is certainly often the better answer. I mean, especially when you think about how calculus works. You know, if you're trying to figure out, well, you know, why would a particular bridge sway a certain way? Especially if you have people walking on it, why do they all somehow automatically start walking in step with one another? And as they do, the bridge actually starts swaying with them, and the more that there are, the more it sways, and eventually, of course, the bridge collapses. Unless, as an engineer, you know how to predict the way that would work, and you would put in elements to make sure that it doesn't do that, right? You know, so there's an equation that you could, you know, I'm drawing it on myself because my son gave me a T-shirt with that equation on it, and the way the T-shirt reads, it says, what part of, and then you've got the equation, and then it says, don't you understand? You know, of course, that's hilarious because, you know, I don't understand any of it, right? But my son was got his civil engineering degree here, and they gave that T-shirt out at some picnic, you know, that he attended. By the way, if you're interested in making money, I highly recommend civil engineering because he walked across the stage, graduating, you know, that week he got a job making more money than I ever have, and got way too much money, actually, you know, for his own good, right?
Is there such a thing?
I think so. I think so. I mean, you could end up with enough money that you run for president, even though you shouldn't. I mean, that happens, you know. Okay, so fact value distinction. Up until the end of the Middle Ages, they thought that values were true. And you might want to argue, yes, that they are. But what David Hume persuaded people to believe in was that they turn out to be neither true nor false. So it's not that he's, after David Hume, the arguments are that value statements are false. The problem is that if you have a room full of people and you're trying to figure out, should we pay people $3,000 for their permanent fund dividend or not? And you've got, you know, half of them that say no and half of them that say yes. Neither answer is true. You might also want to say, well, but neither answer is false. It's just they're neither true nor false. So that's been the answer that we've had ever since then, is to say that value statements are neither true nor false. In fact, there's an expression that says they're non-cognitive. And what they mean by that is that you can't have those, say, like in a computer program, and the computer knows what to do with them. They're non-cognitive. It's not translatable into yes or no, right? You know, so value statements are neither true nor false. And so this ends up being an issue where scientists who want true or false answers cannot deal with value statements or morality. So who gets morality? Religion gets morality. I love Stephen Jay Gould's book where he says, I've got to make sure I get it right here. Science gets how the heavens go. Religion gets how to go to heaven. Religion, there's another one that's just, religion gets the ages of rock, science gets the ages of rocks, and religion gets the rock of ages.
Oh my goodness sakes.
Right? You know, so that's Stephen Jay Gould. That's terrific, and that's in Rock of Ages. Rocks of Ages. Small little book, not nearly as big as the other one. This one is like, maybe like that. In fact, I'm sure they tell us how many pages. 256. So that's what?
That's also bad.
About 1/5 the size of
Yeah.
the other one, right? So rocks of ages, right? And by the way, he argues that there is so religion gets its area of expertise and science gets its area of expertise. And the two of them don't really overlap. They're non-overlapping magisterias, he calls them, right? You know, so religion is concerned with how to get to heaven, you know, and science is how the heavens go, right? And so don't get those questions mixed up, right? So if you're reading the Bible and you're absolutely insistent that things are literally as you're interpreting, you're still interpreting. But if you're saying it's literally the way I'm interpreting it, and you're talking about scientific questions, you're making a mistake. Right? That's not what religion is good at. It's trying to figure out, the sun didn't stop for Joshua to win the battle, right? You know, that just No, that doesn't work, right? It's not my fault. This is an odd puzzle, reading about Jesus walking on water, right? That sounded puzzling to me. Well, I did my own little research, and either in Hebrew or in Greek, the Koine Greek, New Testament, people do not have a verb to swim. Fish swim, but people walk. And so when you think about what Jesus would have looked like if he were swimming, it looks an awful lot like you're walking in the water. So easy, Jesus knew how to swim. And Peter, oddly, did not. So if he's literally floundering in the water, he's a fisherman that doesn't know how to swim. Peter comes over and swims. It's not like Jesus said the rocks are over here. No, he actually was able to help Peter swim. And when they wrote that out, they didn't have a verb that says Jesus was swimming. Instead, he was walking on the water, right? And really, you know, if you think about it, you're kind of just cruising. You know. That's just my interpretation of that confusing situation. You know, so you know, you can apply science to try to figure out the puzzling elements in the scripture, whatever. Okay.
I have a question. So earlier you said like fallacious versus valid arguments and using value statements, and if you're using value statements in your argument, if they're not part of the premise, then it's a fallacious argument? Is that right?
Right. If your conclusion contains a value statement, but your premises don't contain a value statement, then your argument's invalid. Because there's something in the premise, in the conclusion that's not in the premise, right? You could fix it by putting a value statement in the premise, but the problem is now that we can't agree that that premise is true or false.
So how does that work when it comes to the law? Because isn't almost all law about values? Like
I
the
don't think so.
value of like, well, I mean, it could be argued, like, some people believe murder is wrong, and some people think that going to war is not murder, it's different, so
Well,
there's
they're not saying that
difference.
murder is wrong, they're saying murder is illegal. Which is agreed on. Unless, of course, it's not murder, it could be self-defense. We get into those kinds of arguments. But notice, we're still trying to figure out what do the people say about this, right?
Right.
And the abortion issue is a perfect example of this, because obviously it used to be illegal. And then we went through a period of change where Roe v. Wade became the law of the land, even though states didn't especially appreciate it. And what we're seeing now is a revolution in thought, you know, which you might say a lot of it is coming from the science, because now that we can actually see a fetus in its development. I mean, I think I joked the other day that as soon as you see a fetus, you feel like it's a person, right? But other people will argue that it's not a person, it's not a viable person until it gets its medical degree, right? You know, which is, sorry, that's a Jewish joke, you know, but it's not my fault. I'm just trying to be funny. It's politically incorrect. But yeah, we're fighting over whether or not a fetus is a person. We could talk about whether we should kill people for killing people. You know, if we want to say that killing people is wrong, so what do we do with this person that killed 90 women? Right? Are you familiar with him? Right? just, he's in jail.
Bundy was pretty active, but he didn't kill 90.
Oh, right.
So they're thinking he's killed 90 people. So should we execute him? Should we kill somebody for killing people? But you think, wait a minute, you know, if it's morally incorrect for us to kill someone, then how do we come across as a society killing someone? There are other societies that feel executing people for crimes is wrong. The United States is oddly different than that, and a lot of Western societies critique us for that. I mean, there's other societies that, you know, will shoot you in the head just for standing in front of a tank in Beijing Square, you know, or Tiananmen Square, rather, right? No, they didn't. I don't think.
They ran over.
Well, yeah, I guess that would do it too, wouldn't it?
So my question is, does logic then not apply to like
It does apply to
legal
morality.
argumentation? Because I hear like to me there's a lot of value statements that are
Right,
being argued.
right.
So
Right.
if we're arguing value statements, then is there not it not
We
logical?
try to avoid value statements in law. We want it to be cut and dry, black and white, so right? Did you go through the light or not? It's illegal for you to go through the light, so you get fined. And if you killed somebody by doing it, then of course, you know, there's more penalties, etc., as defined by law. So you're not looking at we certainly wouldn't insist that it's a moral issue. In fact, I would argue that you're absolutely right to say that law is a moral issue. There's an interesting quote, you probably are familiar with it, you can't legislate morality, right? And so what do we mean by that? My thinking about that is that, well, morality is being legislated. The trouble is you can't actually make people behave. So in other words, if you say you can't legislate morality, I mean, we can have laws, and they are clearly moral, but that doesn't mean that someone will realize, oh, I'm not supposed to strangle a woman, then I will. I mean, they just did, right? You know, actually they shot her, right? You know, the ones that just shot the woman
Those
that...
teenagers.
Right,
Yeah.
right. You know, you think, whoa, you know, it's illegal to do that, you know, but obviously they did it. So in a sense, we can't legislate morality. But absolutely, that's what legislation is. We're legislating morality. It's just, well, but that doesn't actually stop people from doing immoral things, right? And you certainly can have cogent, valid arguments where you're talking about values. But what has to happen is you have to be talking in a system where your statements have a truth value.
So
But
like,
science doesn't assign truth value to moral statements. So what you've got to be doing is working within a context where all of the people involved believe that the moral statements have a truth value.
can
But
you give
science,
for instance?
well, I mean, if you were in the Roman Catholic Church and you believe that a woman is pregnant and so an abortion is immoral, that would be true in that context, right? The thing is, if you're a medical doctor, and of course if you're a Roman Catholic medical doctor, on the one hand you might believe what the magisteria of the church says, right? But as a scientist, you're a medical doctor, right? You're sworn to do what your patient wants, right? So if the patient wants an abortion and you're in a state that allows it and you have the hospital available, etc., you're under that obligation there. That's of course torture to some people that want to avoid being in a situation where what they believe on Sundays is in conflict with what they believe the rest of the week, right? So of course that's an issue for a lot of people. But that's where we get this problem between science and faith, science and religion. I wouldn't say faith because actually, remember, the axioms on any complex system have to be accepted on faith. So you can't prove the axioms, you have to accept them by faith. So you are going to have faith before you can have any other arguments, right? But when you're looking at, say, a complex system of statements about morality that are part of the tenets of a religion, the dogma of a religion, right? Scientists are not part of that by definition. You might call that a science. Theology would definitely be considered a science, right? A body of knowledge. And if you like that sort of thing, here's all of the answers. If you have questions on religion. Here's all your answers on the sacred doctrine. This is Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica. He also has the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is the summation of the law, religious law, for arguments against the Gentiles. So if you're talking with someone who doesn't believe in your faith, etc., you can go to the Summa and find the right answer, so that when they ask a question, you can say, here's the answer. Right? You don't have to be confused. Is doctrine necessary? Is it a science? So here's the question on, is sacred doctrine a science? Objection 1, it seems that sacred doctrine is not a science, for every science proceeds from self-evident principles, axioms. But sacred doctrine proceeds from articles of faith, which are not self-evident, since their truth is not admitted by all, for all men have not faith. Right? By the way, the argument that yes, actually, axioms are principles of faith, that came much later. That's Kurt Gödel, remember, and not Aquinas. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a science, says the one objection, right? Objection 2, further, no science deals with individual facts, but this sacred science treats of individual facts such as the deeds of Abraham, Isaac, etc. On the contrary, and by the way, all of the Summae, all of the articles are built this way, where they have the sic et non, the yes and the no, right, are in conflict with one another. The objections and on the contraries, right? Augustine, St. Augustine, says on the Trinity, to this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened. But this can be said of no science except sacred doctrine. Therefore, sacred doctrine is a science. Right? I answer that. So here's your answer, and this is how you'd speak to resolve this kind of a conflict. Sacred doctrine is a science. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence, such as arithmetic and geometry and the like. There are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry, and music from principles established by arithmetic. Notice he's talking about higher, remember the quadrivium and the trivium, right? So it is that sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed, etc. And so if you're interested in that, there's all that as well. So keep in mind that when we're talking about a model-dependent realism, in order for us to understand whatever, we have to have a model of it, right? We have to have a language, we have to have, you know, a program that we're basically running in our heads that basically works so that we know what we're doing, etc., right? And so in that sense, we've got several different kinds of programs we could be running. We have a science where we're talking about biology. We have a science where we're talking about theology or morality, right? Or art. If you think about it, what's more beautiful? You know, which music is the most beautiful music ever written? Right? Can I ask that question? You know, with anybody actually, you know, believing the answer, right? You know, well, within a particular context, we can, right? It wouldn't be the normal context of everyday speech with everybody else, because I'm sure whatever kind of music you like, and you know, if I told you, oh, you're listening to the wrong music, that's not the right music. You're just screwing up your brain. You're listening, you know, acid rock. Oh, get away from it, you know? You know, you listen to too much of that stuff and you'll look like that, you know, instead. I'm just, no, I,
Don't look
that was
like
just,
that.
I was just.
Yeah, I'm laughing at it. I appreciate
No,
it.
actually.
Or
was just
I
kidding.
guess I could say I can appreciate it.
The other day, we were talking about Walter Kaufman, who died when he was 59, and he had gone to Africa on like traveling around the world, and he'd gone to Africa, and while he was there, he picked up a parasite, which went to his brain and killed him. And you know, that's kind of sad. But we were sitting in a room with all, you know, a bunch of different folks, and one of the folks was an English teacher here at UAA who is at least biracial, I don't know. In any case, I discovered that, as I said, he went to Africa, and I looked at him. That's so wrong, you know, how can, why did I do that? But that's obviously an indicator of how old I am, you know, how I grew up in a neighborhood that
100 years ago, that was acceptable.
it was 120 years ago, so no. It feels like it was 120 years ago. All right. So fact value. There's several other things that David Hume did with the same kind of argument. For example, when we're looking at colors, and we see, you know, whatever, this spot on the whiteboard and this spot on the whiteboard are the same color. Right? Well, wait a minute. How do I explain that? Because what I'm saying is these particles are exactly the same as these particles. Can I be saying that there are particles that exist in two places at once? Well, no, right? These particles are on the left and these particles are on the right. Well, but what do you mean they're the same color? Well, they are. They're the same color. So the same particles are in two places at once? No. They're not really the exact same particles, they're just very similar, right? Okay, so what makes them very similar? Well, they've got a part that's exactly the same. Oh, well, so then you've got particles that are exactly the same in two places? No. We don't have, right, okay, you get the idea. Once you start on that Murray path, right, you keep going lower and lower and try to explain how it works. You're welcome to try to figure that out. As far as I understand it, there's no adequate explanation for it. Somehow, we universalize, we categorize things. We say that color is the same as that, etc. Right? We're all humans, right? We all, so we have all these categories, as Aristotle said, that they're collective nouns, etc. Well, what makes them all the same? It can't be that they're all the same particles in multiple places. So when we get right down to it, we don't really know how it is the case that we can understand things to be similar.
Isn't it just the atoms are reflecting electromagnetic wavelengths that is similar, if not really almost the same?
Well, yes, you're going down to smaller and
Wavelength.
smaller particles, but you still end up with the same problem. It doesn't go away. It's not my fault. And you could go to David Hume and try to figure out how that works. So there's the is-ought problem. Talking about the bundle of sensations, causal determinism, the free will that goes away. Oh, by the way, even worse, you think of yourself as a self. What makes you think you're a self? A persistent self. By the way, we don't actually think of ourselves as persistent selves academically anymore. In fact, the problem is that you are no one.
Back when I listened to a whole bunch of acid rock, I remember this conversation. I am not me.
Thank you, David Hume. He persuaded people to puzzle this one out. I think of myself as a self. Why? Well, I remember myself being myself in previous experiences, but guess what? I'm trusting a memory, which is fallacious. Could be fallacious. How do I know? Plus, of course, I'm not exactly the same person I was just a second ago. Those different parts of my complex system are rearranging themselves constantly, etc. So in a manner of speaking, I'm just like that river that is constantly changing because different water comes in and different water goes out. So you can't step into the same river twice. I'm not the same person twice. Try that with the IRS. Hey, you're charging me taxes on the money that this other guy made last year, No, that won't work. IRS will still get you. Okay. So David Hume, really interesting. We think of him as part of not only the Scottish Enlightenment, but how the Scots changed the modern world, etc. There's all kinds of interesting stuff associated with that. Okay, but let me where was that? What was a particular part of the text, value statements, etc. Yeah, in chapter 3, or rather chapter 2. So factual and verbal disputes, that's another aspect of this. Cognitive and emotive meaning. Okay, so this is in the text, page 94. Cognitive meaning. Language that is used to convey information has cognitive meaning. Emotive meaning, language that is used to express emotion or feelings, has emotive meaning. And so we end up then with the description of a value claim, notice page 95. A judgment that someone or something is good or bad, moral or immoral, or better or worse than another person or thing. Right? So that's a value statement. And those are neither true nor false in the scientific sense, because, well, if you don't agree with me, I can't tell you you're wrong. You just disagree with me, right? Vitamins, you should have some vitamin C each day, or vitamin D. I mean, there's a lot of vitamins. On the other hand, they don't have proof that any of those vitamins are actually good. They might be just flushing right down the toilet. We don't know what any of that stuff actually does.
Well, the vitamin C at least keeps you from getting scurvy, right? So, I mean,
I've never had scurvy actually, so I don't know. And I don't live on a houseboat, so no. Okay, so the next interesting section is now page 98, the difference between factual and verbal disputes. And this is such a lively issue for us today. I hear all the time, especially in politics. I think I've mentioned, people will say, Trump lied about such and such. Well, when you look at the statements that he's making, those aren't statements that could be considered either true or false. They're theories, usually. And his theory is maybe, not very good as far as you're concerned. You like this theory instead. But that doesn't mean you could say that Trump is lying about it. He's just wacko, maybe, about whatever he's, On the other hand, everyone's absolutely amazed. He keeps accomplishing stuff. Whoa. How does that happen? If he's wacko, how can he actually accomplish things, Well, maybe that's what we really needed, was a wacko president, for a while,
I mean, but serial killers accomplish things. That doesn't mean that what they're accomplishing is good.
Well, it depends on the serial.
Oh.
Ha ha ha.
Oh, man.
Maybe that cereal should have been thrown out years ago. Sorry. So, the easy problem here is getting, really, this cannot actually be solved. And that's because what you've got often are people arguing at one another that aren't understanding what the other person is talking about. Or they're using language that sounds similar, but what they connect it to is different. Gun rights, things of that sort. You can think about all sorts of things associated with that. I mean, the idea of arming teachers so that, there's people in a school that would help if someone came in and started shooting the children in the school. You had the teachers armed so they could fight back, right? Boy, when that idea came out, that was absolutely amazing how many folks were like, oh yeah, that will really help. I know a lot of my friends, just thought, don't give me a gun, I'll start shooting the kids. Cause some of them are like, blam, next child. They don't want to be armed, because, that's, they have rough days. On the other hand, what is it? A couple states now are actually doing this, arming teachers. In fact, they just recently changed the law so that in one state, so that more teachers will have, it originally was passed so that only a few teachers in the school would have weapons, and they realized, well, what we need are really a lot more. So a lot of the teachers are getting gun training, and we're going to start carrying guns. But of course, it'll still be up to the teacher. I mean, you're not going to have teachers that don't want to carry guns forced to carry guns, but you'll have some folks that maybe are retired military or something, that feel comfortable with the gun, and so that'll happen.
PTSD and guns go great together.
They do, they do, they do.
Well, then what do you do with the African American teachers? How many cops have killed African American people with hands on steering wheels or hands in the air? And saying, please don't shoot me, I'm with an autistic man, or young children playing with toys outside of playgrounds, or, I mean, so are we only arming white teachers, or are they gonna have a way to distinguish? I mean, most mass shooters are white men, middle-aged white men, but you know, our cops love to kill unnecessarily African, so how does that work?
Well, the first thing I would point out is that you're dealing with an interesting problem with the way the media works.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the
See
McEwen
news
Hall.
items
My
about
name's
this
Joel
individual
Oberlander. I'm a
was shot,
professor in
by the
mathematics
police,
at the university and a member of the Gifford Lectureship
We see
Committee.
that in the
I am
media
standing in for Professor Sir Timothy O'Shea,
for perhaps
who's the
months,
convener of the committee,
thinking
at
about that
Preston
particular
University.
thing.
And he is in fact just arrived
When
back
we
in
look at
time
the
to attend
statistics,
this
though,
meeting.
what we discover is
So
that
it gives
that
me
doesn't
great
really
pleasure this
happen very
evening to
often.
introduce Professor Stephen Pinker to give his Gifford lecture
And so
on
what's
Confederate
happening
Angels of Our
apparently,
Nature, a history of
we're
violence
being
and
influenced
humanity.
by how many times
Now,
and how
let me
close
say
up
a
we
few words
see
about
this
Stephen
problem,
Pinker.
and we
A
begin
native
thinking
of
that the
Montreal, he
problem
received his BA
is
from
serious.
Gill University in
That was a
1976.
major problem
and
in
his
our
PhD in psychology
society.
from Harvard in 1979.
You wouldn't call cops killing
After
innocent
serving on the
people a
faculty
serious
of Harvard
problem?
Oh,
and
it
Stanford
is,
for a
it
year each,
is, but
he
how
moved to
often
MIT
does it
in
happen?
1982.
I mean, the police govern themselves, so how do we really know?
Oh,
As the
really?
Johnson Family
Who's
Professor.
in charge of
policeman
policing
that
the
was
police?
just,
Professor Pinker is a cognitive scientist who
just
carried out
found
research
guilty
in
of
language
murdering
and
the
its
person
connections
that
to
called
cognition, social
for help,
relationships,
because
child
she
development,
thought being raped.
neural information
And when they
processing,
got there, they shot
human
her.
evolution, and theories of
That
human
person
nature.
has been
This
found
work
guilty
has
and is
won
going
many
to jail
prizes,
for like
including
15 years.
the Trolley
How
Award
many,
from the
though?
National Academy of Sciences,
Well,
the
that's
Henry
the
Dale
thing
Prize from
that's,
the Royal Institution of Great Britain.
The end of the lecture. The fourth decline of violence has been called the long peace, and it speaks
So,
to the,
in this book, Steven
assertion
Pinker
that the 20th century was the most violent in history. However,
points out that
no one who
violence is
makes this
actually
claim ever looks
decreasing.
at centuries other than
worldwide.
the 20th. So this is a
And that we're
alleged
living now in the
trend
most
based on
peaceful
one data
era
point.
of human
And there are
existence
many reasons to doubt
as
that
far
it's
as
true.
our data.
Even if one looks only at the 19th century, which is often held to be
So
a more peaceful
I'm
era
not going
of
to
the
play this
20th century,
whole thing.
one discovers episodes
But
of
one of
mass
the things he
murdering,
talks
such as
about
the
in this is, so
Napoleonic
why
Wars,
do we feel like things are worse? Because a lot of people feel like things are worse
Taiping
now
Rebellion
than
in
ever.
China, the most
And
destructive
the
civil
answer
war in
is,
history,
well,
which
our
killed
media
20 million.
is in our face all the
most,
time, and it's
lethal
always
war in
talking about
American history,
horrible
being
things
the
that are
American
going
Civil War,
on,
which with 650,000
not necessarily
deaths.
the wonderful
In
things that are going
Africa,
on.
the conquest of
So
Shaka
what we
Zulu
end up
estimated
is
to
this
kill between 1 and 2 million
unbalanced
people.
view of the
Turning
situation
to
that
South
we're in.
America, we find the
That's a
most
result of
proportionally
this
destructive
media
interstate
giving
war
us
in history,
an
the
overwhelming
War of the Triple
impression
Alliance,
that
which
we're
killed
going to hell in a
60% of the
handbasket.
population of
But
Paraguay,
actually, this is the
together
most
with
peaceful,
slave raiding
peaceful,
wars in
wonderful
Africa and imperial wars in
time
Africa,
in human
Asia, and
existence.
South Pacific, where we can't even begin to estimate the death tolls.
Even in the third world countries.
Also, while it is
So
indisputably
I
true
won't,
that the
I
Second
won't
World War was
play more of this, but take a look at this when you get the chance. And if you get the chance, read this book. And also, Enlightenment Now is his follow-up book to this. And they're absolutely fantastic.
But is that theory or is it based on like
Well,
science?
this is, well,
Like,
he
did
is a
somebody do
scientist.
study
He is
and-
looking at the data. But it is an interpretation of the data. And of course, there are critics of his point of view. So, but I think he's very persuasive.
Well, there's critics that say the world isn't round. I mean, there's going to be critics of everything.
Kind of ovate, it's more like an egg. But from here to there, it's flat. So I'm a flat earther myself, at least from here to Anchorage, which I think was the problem. The flat earthers didn't go very far. I've been in an airplane, and I've seen the curvature of the Earth. Plus, I love using my Oculus Rift on virtual reality, and I've accidentally discovered myself floating out in space occasionally. Whoa, that's kind of interesting. I really should, once you guys are down to just like maybe 5 or something, come each week. Everybody else is watching the video, if that, right? Maybe I'll bring in the Oculus and give you each a chance to see what it does. So verbal dispute. So the job of the logician with a verbal dispute is to say, hey, wait a minute, let's define your terms. Let's figure out what you two are saying. Are you meaning the same things? And basically then analyze the discussion. And often what happens is you end up realizing that you two both actually agree on everything. It's just you don't talk about it the same way, and you're mad at one another because of the way you talk about it, right? So translate that conflict, and it turns out not to be even there, right, as an issue, right? Oh, I agree. I thought you meant such and such, right? That can often happen. Of course, what happens when you discover, yes, that they understand one another perfectly well, and they're just really at a moral impasse with one another. Killing a fetus is wrong. Killing a fetus is just a bloody blob that I could just flush down the toilet. That's all, Well, okay. You can't really, logicians can't fix that. That's not my fault. I have a friend that's had multiple miscarriages, and that's what she thinks of them. They're just bloody blobs. Oh well, there goes another one. I, on the other hand, Donna and I could not make our own children. We read the book, followed the directions, and nothing. Donna even had an operation that didn't help either, but we applied and were given 4 absolutely, well, actually 3 marvelous children and 1 other one that, but 3 out of 4, that's not bad.
It's not bad.
In the end, so they were all special needs, et cetera. But we raised 4 wonderful children. I mentioned, Billy's an engineer, artist. So they each have had their successes, except for the one who's in jail right now, et cetera. But that's so we valued the children that we got, and we were absolutely thrilled that 8 people actually. We figure that 4 separate children with 2 different, natural parents. We're supernatural; they're natural. And we ended up with 4 children. So we're very grateful that 4 people who didn't want a child nonetheless kept it until it was viable, even though it wasn't in medical school. Okay, chapter 3, diagramming arguments is boring as sin, but an important chapter if you're not familiar with how arguments go. So this is really an important chapter for you to focus on what a conclusion is. Should we take a break, or you're okay?
I'll be right back.
So figuring out what a conclusion is in all the paragraph. Remember to keep in mind that some paragraphs there might not even be an argument. Depends on the emphasis of the speaker, on what they're trying to accentuate, etc. Are they trying to persuade you, or are they just describing the physics of the Tower of Pisa, which, by the way, is moving back into the upright position. So that's kind of interesting.
Really?
Yeah.
No
The
way.
Latest measurements are that it's the ground is shifting back, and it's moving back to the vertical, and that has everybody in Pisa worried, because if it completely straightens out, then no one's going to want to come and see it anymore, and that's going to totally ruin their tourist trade. You know. It'll make it safer though, you know, because you can imagine Galileo dropping all the different things he dropped from that tower. That was very dangerous in that time, living near that tower, because they dropped a lot of things that could have killed people.
Postcards of when it was leaning though would like maybe fly off the shelves.
Oh, yeah, well, I would have loved to have my own selfie, you know how they did. It'd be just my luck, it would fall all the way over while I was doing it. Okay, so look at these. It starts off with little diagrams, so premise, conclusion, 1 to 2. Independent premises, convergent, I'm looking at page 106, convergent diagram. Premise 2, 3, 4 all support the conclusion, which is number 1. And what they're doing here, by the way, is numbering the statement in the paragraph, and so that if you're trying to figure out, well, which is the conclusion, you find that particular number, put that down at the bottom, and then figure out how the premises all support that particular conclusion. And how do you know what it means to say it's supporting? Does the statement contain information that gives you grounds for thinking that the other statement is true, right? That's what you're looking for in arguments, right? Then, of course, it gets more and more complex. You get more extended arguments. You can get, for example, the State of the Union address. I remember one year I diagrammed George Bush's State of the Union address that year, and it was kind of interesting because it turned out to be Barbara, 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 all the way down. I didn't realize it was absolutely boring as sin. It was clearly done by a professional. It wasn't, of course, done by George Bush, but you get the idea. It was a highly structured argument, so that when you looked at it, you could disagree with George Bush at one of his points, but what you had to do was disagree with the truth of one of his premises. The argument itself was valid all the way through, right? So if you accepted it as premises, you had to accept his conclusions. Okay. So let me get started then on chapter 4, unless you have questions, because this is fun. Fallacies. And the first part of it is informal fallacies. And the difference between formal fallacies and informal is informal fallacies are not really even arguments. They're not at least formal arguments. In other words, they don't follow an argument form that could be valid, right? Instead, these are psychologically persuasive. They're psychologically persuasive. And they really are psychologically persuasive. And in fact, you might want to use them occasionally because they are psychologically persuasive to get something done. Raising children, you want your children to do your homework. Do your homework, I'll help you, but I want you to do your homework. I don't want to do my homework. Do your homework, or no TV. Rats. And then the kid sits down and starts doing his homework. You just gave a psychological argument, essentially, to this child, which we might call the argument ad baculum. You used a bat. Well, you didn't actually use a bat. You used the TV privilege, right? You're threatening to take away a privilege, in order to get the child to do something. So that's very persuasive, obviously. Parents use this all the time, but it's not a formal argument. So we certainly refer to it then as a fallacy, because if what we're looking for is a formal argument, then using an ad baculum is a fallacy. It's not a good argument. It might work, but there's the problem, right? Now, a lot of these arguments, though, are not only psychologically persuasive, they're also annoying as heck, and you don't want to get caught with them. So, for example, the policeman that pulls you over and says, are you still using drugs? And now you're stuck, because if you say, no, I'm no longer using drugs, it sounds like you used to be using drugs, which is wrong, right? But if you say yes, well, that's bad too, right? Because now you're saying that you're still using drugs. So he's set you up with a dilemma, right, where you're caught on the horns of this dilemma, right? Either answer that he offers you, basically yes or no, is a bad answer for you, right? And what do? In that case, you have to recognize that he's trying to get you to answer a question in a way that's going to be bad for you either way, and you can take the horns of the dilemma and jump over the middle and not answer it the way he's trying to force the question, right? Because he's basically setting you up with a fallacy, right? Assuming that only the two possible answers he's giving you are the right answer, you might want to say, no, I never use drugs, etc. Which, other than like caffeine, alcohol, since roughly about 15 years ago.
If you said I did some caffeine this morning, they might
did,
look a little
actually.
bit closer into you. Right, but in the event that you are talking to a police officer, if you tell them that, they might think a little.
When they ask you that kind of thing, they mean illegal drugs. They don't mean aspirin or caffeine, things of that sort. So why do we study fallacies? Well, it's important to know them. TV ads constantly set you up with fallacious arguments. Absolutely hilarious sometimes to sit and watch them trying to say, just buy my pillow. And if you buy this pillow, I'll give you a second one for free for only an extra fee.
Are you ready to be a part of the winning team?
It's just absolutely fascinating the way, especially late at night ads, you wonder, who the heck is sitting up late at night? People that need to be hungry for some reason. Because all the delicious hamburgers you could buy, which, by the way, I think they're very persuasive. Those hamburgers look absolutely delicious. And if you see a hamburger, you want a hamburger. Does that make sense? I suppose.
But wait, there's more.
We often encounter, so page 120, we often encounter arguments that appear to be correct, but on close inspection, they lack real merit. Trying to pin down why can be a challenge. So that's a reason we study fallacies, right? Homer says, not a bear in sight, the bear patrol must be working like a charm. Lisa, this is Homer Simpson, right? You're familiar with the, right? That's spacious reasoning, Dad, says Lisa, who's the brilliant one in the family. I guess you're familiar with the family, right? Oh, thank you, dear. By your logic, I could claim that this rock keeps tigers away. Oh, how does it work? Because Dad is so dumb, right? I think she's right. It doesn't work, says Lisa. I'm sure she's frustrated with her father at that point. Right? Uh-huh. It's just a stupid rock. Uh-huh. But I don't see any tigers around, do you? Lisa, I want to buy your rock. Etc. Much a-poo about nothing. A-poo is the store clerk, I think.
Yeah.
So a formal fallacy is one that's got an actual logical error in it, but was an attempt at creating a really formal argument. So that one's a formal fallacy. But an informal fallacy is it's everyday language. It's different from an error in the form or structure of an argument. It's usually psychologically persuasive. So that's why we studied that. A lot of them are based on personal attacks or emotional appeals. That's insulting people, for example. And so for the first one, what we have is referred to page 122. You've probably heard some of these. It's interesting that we get the Latin expression for a lot of them. And that's used, by the way. So for example, ad hominem, towards the man, basically, in Latin, right? And so you're arguing with someone, President Trump, I would never vote for someone with hair like that, right? Right? That has nothing to do with anything that he said or anything, you're talking about the character of the person, right? And it's not true, by the way, because I love Boris Johnson. I think he'd be great, and his hair is just like President Trump's. Right? You seen Boris Johnson?
Not ringing a bell.
Doesn't ring a bell. I'm counting on him being the next Prime Minister of England. It's not exactly the same kind of hair as President Trump, but it's
Same
close.
ballpark.
You get the same, it's the bright yellow thing. And by the way, most of the time he wears ties a lot like President Trump too. But so ad hominem is when you're arguing with someone and you criticize the person. Well, I'm not going to vote for him because he's gay. Right? What does that have to do with the person's platform and what they might do or how they might perform as president, right? Nothing, right? But you're just mad at him because of his preference, sexual preference. Well, that's an ad hominem, not a legitimate argument, right? Unless, of course, character is part of what I suppose you're thinking about in that whole thing.
I have a question. So let's say there's a whole bunch of idiots right now in Congress, and one of those idiots thinks that you can see the inside of a woman's uterus when she swallows a camera. So would an argument be that, no, maybe not, no, because it would be a fallacy. So like, XYZ person believes that women can have their uterus seen by swallowing a camera. That person's an idiot, so I'm not going to vote for an idiot that
Well, you
thinks
can't.
that.
He's in a different state.
But if I was in the same state.
Well,
But then I just...
I'd have to actually take a poll in the state among his voters, because they might actually believe
that you can see a woman's uterus after she swallows a camera.
I mean, there are people that believe the world is flat.
There are Congress people that believe rape is consensual. So, I mean, okay, you're right. I can see now where this class is going to be helpful.
It is really hard not to do ad hominem attacks at times, just because, especially with Trump, he might be right on some things, but people will be like, oh, but he's wrong on all these other things. I don't know, I find it really hard not to do that sometimes.
There's actually lots of paintings of this, but the founding of Rome is based on the gangs that were the original founders of Rome inviting the neighbors from the Sabines to come and visit for a party. And once they all came, they killed the men and they stole the women and raped the women. So the rape of the Sabine women is one of the founding stories of Rome. So as far as Rome is concerned, rape is perfectly fine. It's part of their historical founding mythology. By the way, a lot of states believe that marital rape is impossible.
It's legal in Alaska.
That's what I understand.
So you had mentioned ad hominem was attacks on, say, somebody's hair, the fact that they're gay. Would that also include an over-exaggeration of somebody's policy? Like if you called somebody a baby-killing monster, like they're not literally a baby-killing monster, but say that they do believe in pro-choice, they are for abortions. Would that still be considered?
And I
as
think
ad
your
hominem?
question too about the congressman that thought swallowing a camera, would, I mean, their understanding of science and everything, bringing that up. Would that be an ad hominem, or would it be a critique of a particular argument? Initially, my thinking is if you're criticizing what the person was saying, right? And do you remember what he was actually thinking you could use the camera for, to see if the fetus was there?
I don't. I think that's what it was for, though. Yeah.
Yeah, because technology is absolutely amazing. Remember the Dorito commercial?
How did this camera thing even be brought up? Like, why wouldn't you just use an ultrasound?
You would. That's why he's an idiot.
Right. Okay.
Was he a senator?
But like, how does that get brought up?
How what?
How does it get brought up? How does somebody's mind
It's
go
in
there?
it's a part of the abortion debate. Like, there's a senator that believes that when you have a tubal pregnancy, you can move the embryo from the tube to the uterus, which is false. Can't be done. Depending on how big the embryo is, you may end up losing your fallopian tube. But he believes you can move it. And he's convinced whole tons of people that it works.
Alright.
I don't understand that. So, I mean, is it a logical fallacy to say they're idiots?
That's still an ad hominem. To refer to the speaker as an idiot is an ad hominem, not. But what you want to be doing is arguing against their argument and showing a counterexample, or that a particular premise is false, etc. Right? You don't want to be arguing against the person who's delivering the argument, because that shouldn't be part of the science of whether the issue is right or wrong. Right?
Yeah. I guess.
The next one, ad hominem circumstantial. This one, my favorite with this is if you connected to the oil industry, then you're probably not going to vote for higher taxes against the oil industry, because you're profiting from what the oil industry profits, etc. So when we talk about the senators and the legislators all being funded by oil industry in order to get elected, well, of course they're not going to vote against raises in taxes on the oil or whatever. I mean, obviously we could easily fix all of our problems by just taxing the oil companies more. But what the trouble, of course, is everybody that's sitting in the legislature have been supported by the oil companies, because you have to have so much money to get elected, etc. Right? Well, strictly speaking, that's an ad hominem, right? Literally, you could actually receive money from an oil company and not vote for the benefit of the oil company. I've actually known some legislators who received money from an oil company, but insisted that they were still going to vote the way they thought,